Hello and good afternoon. Welcome to this podcast on fighting climate change the Zambian way. I am Nico Heller, and this is Reboot 2030, a Democracy School podcast. My guest today is Akufuna Muyunda. Akufuna is an award-winning climate leader and social entrepreneur. He's also the founder of Young Volunteers for Environment Zambia and serves as a volunteer director of green investments at the Farmers Development Cooperative Union. I can see that Akufuna is already here, so let me invite him in. Hey, Akufuna, how are you doing? Can you see me?
Yes, Nico, I can see you and greetings from Zambia.
I'm so glad. I'm so glad you're here. It's such a nice situation. I mean, how often does it happen? That Zambians and Germans get together to talk about climate change. I think
Yeah,
this needs to happen a lot more because I think we're quite dependent on each other, really, when you think about it, to solve this global problem. Now, I have already given a very brief introduction, so let's kind of like kick it off. Let's kind of dive straight in. I mean, Akufuna, you have been a climate activist and quite a leading activist, really, in that sense, for many years now. Now, tell me, what got you started on this journey? Why did you become a climate activist? And what were the main hurdles, the main challenges that you had encountered along the way?
yeah, Nico, it's been an interesting journey for me. I think dated as far back as when I was in my year 12 at my high school. I was very active in extracurricular activities, and particularly in 2007, the Ministry of Environment then, through the Meteorological Department, conducted what we call the the Western Province, or rather regional competition on essay writing on global warming. So because of my excitement in getting involved in such endeavors, I participated in the competition for my province. And I got the first prize through that competition by the Meteorological Department on March 2022, on March 22, 2007. So after I won the prize, expectations arose, and a number of my peers started calling me Mr. Global Warming. And I participated in that competition not because I was an expert at climate change or I knew anything about climate change, but actually just did that out of interest. That brought a challenge to me, and I started asking myself questions: What do I have to offer? And everyone is calling me Mr. Global Warming. And fast forward in 2011, I had an opportunity when I was at the University of Zambia to convene young people at the regional climate change conference that was hosted by COMESA in partnership with Green Environment Watch here in Zambia. And at that point, I met like minds, like Mr. Sena Aluka from Togo, who is the executive director for the Young Volunteers for the Environment, African continent wide. And I was spotted and I was given an opportunity to actually set up the organization here in Zambia. And in trying to find answers, I got an opportunity also 4 years later by the first, by the first of all, a partner, which we call FSD, which is Financial Sector Dependent in Zambia, who sponsored my training as a climate reality leader to be mentored and trained by the former US Vice President Al Gore under the Climate Reality Project. And then I thought I had something to offer, but the challenge has been I noticed that there are very few young people involved on the subject matter, and participation levels were so low. I did the first survey where I identified that actually about 85% Zambian young people feel they know nothing about climate change itself. So I thought this is a challenge to me as Mr. Global Warming. Fast forward, I started an organization called Young Volunteers for the Environment so that it can be a platform where we can be able to bring young people together, mobilize voices, and be able to provide capacity building so that our voice can be heard, so that we can be counted, so that we can participate in adding value to the climate change subject at local, regional, and continental level, even global level, where possible. So this journey, Nico, has been difficult. I've been volunteering ever since, and with the vision that one day the political will increase. For Africa, it's very difficult because many look at climate change as a scientific, technical subject, which is so difficult to relate with at the local level and at the personal level. And that has been my mission, to try and be able to break the code around the climate subject, so that even my grandmother in my village can actually feel to be part and parcel of the story on how best we can tackle the climate question. So that's been my journey, Nico. And even today, that's what I still do. And we can talk more as we go through the conversation.
Excellent. Thank you very much for this brief introduction. Really, really interesting stuff. Akufuna, I mean, the tragic thing about climate change really is that much of it has been caused, or is being caused, by the industrialized world. To be more precise, by Europe, increasingly, of course, by China, and by Northern America, the US, and so on and so forth. And developing countries are at the receiving end. Many of whom haven't actually fully industrialized yet, or are at the very beginning of industrializing. So in some ways, climate change must be quite an abstract concept in a way in Africa, because it seems so removed from the daily reality people face in their lives. So in terms of kind of developing a climate awareness and a climate movement in Zambia, what are the real hurdles, the big hurdles that you have to overcome on a daily basis to get the message out?
Yeah, it's really difficult. First of all, we have some cultural backgrounds in terms of traditions. In some beliefs that there's drought because the gods are not happy. In some beliefs that we have to forgive each other if we offended each other, for nature to respond. And it's difficult to break such kind of beliefs when you go to the grassroots and try to communicate this message. In other words, science really is being understood or interpreted differently as you go down to the grassroots itself. But I think the reality is also that Africa is the most vulnerable continent as far as the adverse impact of climate change is concerned, despite our contribution being around 4% in terms of global emission itself. The impacts are very significant. Back here in Zambia, in my mother's village, Shangobo, 2015, I had to actually go online and mobilize resources to support the smallholder farmers that lost their crops due to drought there. And even the little that remained, even 2019, we had the human-animal conflict, where elephants were moving from the west side of Zambia, attacking even the little crops that were left by the villagers in my mother's village then. And that is affecting over 5,000 families that were affected by that. So when you talk about climate change, really, to some extent, people think about it from the surface level, which is how it affects us as humans. But also you can see that in my mother's village, they actually had to fight with elephants, because elephants are also migrating from another area to look for greener pasture, look for food, look for water, which is scarce. And this is how actually now people are beginning to see. And one other factor in which Zambia in particular has been impacted by the impacts of climate change is on, if you look at Zambia, we generate our electricity predominantly on hydro. And hydroelectricity really is about 80 to 90% of the power that we generate here in Zambia. In 2019, about 4,000 people lost their jobs from the mines because production levels went down, and we had to ration the available electricity to supply mines, to supply homes, supply public places like hospitals, schools. So it was a huge pressure and burden on the part of government itself. And it was at that time when now it became clear to a number of people that we are fighting a very serious battle here, which is the climate change itself. And they're able to translate it even to as little as small-scale business owners like barber shops, the salons, and they cannot operate anymore 24/7. They lose out in terms of making profits. They can only work 2 hours in a day. So now they ask questions. What is the problem? So that will provide us an opportunity also as climate leaders, as an environmentalist, to say, this is what we mean, and this is an example of what we are talking about. And this is likely to worsen if we don't have any political will, if you don't take meaningful action. If you, even as a public or private individual citizen, don't participate in fighting this climate change.
I mean, it's interesting. I mean, climate change has a different place in different cultures, in different also political cultures. In Germany, for example, it's been heavily attacked, or the climate movement, it's been heavily attacked by the far right, by the political right, who basically says, well, they have different arguments, but they basically don't see climate change as a real issue. Many think of it as a sort of, it's made up, it's not real. Others think, oh, actually, nature is much bigger than this. How dare you think that humans could, affect that? So there's a whole host of myths and also, just ideology that makes it very difficult for climate activists often to get their viewpoint across. I mean, one example would be is that climate activists, when they block a road, say in Germany, to raise awareness and to demonstrate, they are increasingly called climate terrorists. Whereas if farmers block a road in order to kind of stick with traditional farming practices, everybody feels sorry for them, and politicians make allowances for farmers. So that you have a political situation in Germany and across Europe and North America, which makes it difficult to raise climate awareness also for political reasons. And of course, in Africa, the situation is very different because, of course, you could argue it's not your fault. It originated somewhere else. And B,
Absolutely.
you can say, well, this is a problem of the future, and we have got much more immediate problems to deal with. So as a result of it, I'm sure this would fall to the very back of the list of priorities for politicians, for many people who also would distribute resources, like money for local causes. How do you kind of find that situation? Is it a very difficult situation? Is it easy to raise funding? Is it easy to sort of gain the ear of politicians? What's the situation like in Zambia?
It's the most difficult thing, climate finance, most difficult thing locally, most difficult thing regionally, most difficult thing globally. As you are aware also, like in terms of climate adaptation fund, the $100 billion pledge since 2009 has not been coming up to now. And it is good to see Africa joining forces to actually negotiate as one body and unity. And of course, a good example can be given there on what the outcome from the COP28, COP27 on loss and damage. But I think it is very difficult. And I think what is making it difficult, Nico, is not because of lack of resources and availability of finance alone, but also there are so many other factors. What is preparedness in terms of institutional readiness to manage climate finance? Do we have the technical capacity to manage and run climate finance? Do we understand what projects actually need to be supported by the financial climate change? And those are the answers that we need to put into perspective before even talking about how much you need to receive. And I think African countries are doing a better job in trying to strengthen institutional positioning to manage climate finance. Here in Zambia, for example, we have seen one of the local commercial banks being accredited by the Green Climate Fund. And that is a very good progress made so far. We have also one commercial bank, Zambia Industrial Commercial Bank, which actually is on the readiness package, readiness program on adaptation fund. So they are working on strengthening their policies and also all other technicalities that needs to be put in perspective before they can run climate finance. So those are some of the bottlenecks that needs to be worked on. And when we get there, then it will be easier to receive a significant amount of climate finance that then can trickle down to various other grassroots-based projects, various other livelihood-focused projects to help people build the resiliency in the face of the climate crisis itself. So yes, it is difficult, but also it's difficult for a reason, which is why we need to actually see more mobilization in terms of local resources also to put ourselves in a position where we can have even the human resource, for example. Do we have sustainability experts? If you don't, what do we do? What we do in terms of bringing technology itself? We need technology to actually come to Africa. For Zambia, for example, and the DRC, we saw the partnership that was established to actually establish a factory to put in place electric car batteries production. And that is a good step in the right direction. But of course, that will also to some extent attract climate finance itself. But do we have the technology to do so? Do we have the right maybe mindset itself? We need to have the right mindset to administer climate change-related innovations and initiatives such as that one which the government is put in place. So I think we are on the right trajectory. We just need to accelerate the current efforts we are making in terms of our efforts as Africa as well to position ourselves. But also I think the international community, in the respect to what we usually term as the polluters themselves, they need to demonstrate serious commitment and also be able to respond timely. Because there are so many pledges that they have made, they put on the table, but up to now we are not seeing any meaningful results from those commitments, pledges and pledges. So we need to go beyond pledges and begin to see resources trickling down deliberately to address the issues arising from the climate crisis itself.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because obviously the situation is it's a global problem, but it manifests differently in different places, you know. So and also the needs that arise from that differ from place to place. So, for example, in Europe and North America, the kind of the two biggest challenges are, of course, one is clean energy, but we seem to be making good progress on that in Europe, certainly in Germany. But then there's transport, which is like lacking in Germany. Transition from sort of petrol to e-mobility, you know, that kind of switch from traditional cars to electric cars. There's a big lobby that kind of is dragging its heels, the kind of the car manufacturing lobby. But then there is the real major challenge is to transition from a kind of an old kind of like fossil fuel driven economy to a sort of a lean green economy. And that transitioning looks very different in a mature economy like Germany or North America, where you've got, you know, heavy industry and this, that, and the other, all built on certain premises, versus, you know, Zambia, which is still at the very beginning of that development, and transitioning its economy isn't probably the biggest issue. So when you look at, if you were to sort of ask yourself, what's the difference in need, say, between Europe and Zambia or other places in Africa, what makes your situation, you know, kind of like different?
Yeah, I think ours is different. First of all, we have been impacted by the climate crisis for a long time, even when we didn't know ourselves, even when the political will was almost zero. And this is when everyone is now like, okay, yeah, this is a serious issue. We need to address it. So which means we are behind in terms of policy framework. We are behind in terms of the legal framework. We are behind in terms of the systems that is speak to the economy itself, in terms of how we run the economy. We are also behind in terms of capacity, in terms of technical capacity in the people themselves that we have here. So there's so much that needs to be done. When you look at Europe, I think if you have to look for a sustainability expert, you can just close your eyes. The next time you see but here it's a different story altogether. You have to really hunt to find one. So we have a lot of needs that need to be put into perspective before we actually talk about the just transition, which is why actually the Africa Group of Negotiators indicated displeasure at the outcome from the Global Stocktake report that was shared at the COP28, to say we are not really seeing the equity we are talking about, the fairness we're talking about, because our needs are not addressed as they're supposed to. We are just put on the same plate like everyone else, which is not actually the right thing to do. So we are far, far, far behind, and we need Europe to actually handhold Africa step by step so we can actually be put in a position we can smoothly transition to, I can say, a low carbon economy from the current economy, which is linear. And I think what is clear is it is possible. We have capacity in terms of resources, but we need the technology also to be able to utilize those resources. I can give one example, Nico. Since 2015, we have been working on a project to provide alternative cooking solutions that are clean. Here in Zambia, charcoal is number one, energy material that is used for cooking and everything else. So the over dependence on charcoal is really, inspired by the interest of charcoal itself. Is very affordable. It can easily access it, and that's what everyone uses and prefers to use for cooking. So when we have been advocating for transition from use of charcoal itself to clean means, which like gasifier stoves, like gas itself, or LPG in short, and many other technologies that have been put on the market now, it's been so difficult because it's not competitive enough to replace the use of charcoal and the ordinary brazier itself. So which means there's so much that needs to be done, first of all, to make alternative energy sources, alternative cooking solution, first of all, affordable, first of all, accessible, first of all, actually, easier for people to adapt to, because usually people have to also adapt to the cooking method and cooking sources in terms of energy itself and a bit of that. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of capacity building, also the people involved in the value chain as well, so that at least we can be able to communicate rightly and make right decisions and inform policy as well, but also providing the technology itself and also providing the reason why we have to transition and how we benefit as an individual in the value chain itself. So that's how I can respond to that in terms of the difference we have at the moment. But for sure, we need to point in the same direction as Europe and Africa through partnerships.
I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned the cooking. I mean, Germany is going through a transition at the moment where it is moving away from gas and oil powered heating systems to electric and regenerative heating systems, solar, wind, and so on and so forth. And so there's been sort of a legislative process to phase out these systems, which has run into huge political resistance on the one hand, but also into huge logistical problems. I mean, in terms of supply, in terms of managing the supply chain, making sure that, there's enough, technicians to actually to install these new systems and so on and so forth. There's a huge thing, linked to that. And that transition, and of course, once you have a complex transition to manage, it's very easy to attack it politically, because you will always find things that you may not have thought of or that might have gone wrong or whatever. The more complex system, the easier it gets to attack from the outside. And this is exactly what is happening in Germany, which is kind of massively delayed that transition. Now, of course, Germany is a kind of a highly advanced economy and can throw huge amounts of money at this, so you can almost buy that transition ultimately. But of course, you don't have that option. So I have total sympathy for the challenges you're kind of outlining here, because of course it goes beyond the pure logistics. There's a cultural dimension to that as well. If you've always been cooking that way, then that's how you cook, isn't it? And it's so close, literally so close to home, that it's one of these things that, how dare you trying to change our culture? So there's all of that. I can totally get that. And you get the same thing in a different version of it in Germany. It's so interesting. Very interesting. Now, when you look at the kind of, when you look back at the last sort of 10, 15 years, what were the kind of the biggest, if you like, achievements that you think sort of the sort of Zambian, or the kind of, like, if you like, African climate movement has been able to look back on? What were the biggest achievements, if there are any big achievements, or what are the kind of little achievements that might lead to big ones?
Yeah, I think I can say I'm so proud of the work I've done, so proud of myself. But of course, if you ask me that question 10 years ago, 15 years ago, I was going to give you a very sad answer. But I can guarantee you that in Zambia, for example, we have witnessed increased political will in as far as the fight against climate change is concerned. Fast forward 2016, we saw for the first time the launch of the climate change policy. And of course, I think we are one of the first countries that submitted our NDCs towards the UNFCCC COP27 PREPs. And also in 2021, when we changed government, the new president himself dedicated his manifesto, he dedicated his government priorities to fighting climate change itself. And to do so, he created for the first time the Ministry of Green Economy and Environment in Zambia. And also beyond that, he pioneered the fight against climate change himself. We saw him in Glasgow 2021, where he signed the commitment to end deforestation by 2030 with the UK government. And he has been showing that commitment ever since, even in all his government program that he's doing at the moment. Just now, this year, Nico, of course, last year, I took about 300 youth on the street of Lusaka to call on the president to declare a climate emergency for Zambia. And also, we also called on the president to dedicate or rather create a climate action task force with the idea that we should break the silos in as far as fighting climate change is concerned. We are also calling on the president that he should be able to create within the CDF, which is the Constitutional Development Fund that has been established, and under his administration, he was able to increase it from 1.6 million to 30 million kwacha. So we are asking the president to say, can you create a small allocation or portion, or rather a percentage of this Constitutional Development Fund that will be directly dedicated to climate adaptation projects at the grassroots level. So those are the 3 points that we are calling on the president to actually look into. And if there was no political will, we would have not received any response. But 7 months later, which is this year in March, we saw, actually February, we saw the president declaring drought as a national emergency, as a national disaster, which is what we have been calling for also as climate leaders, as climate environmentalists here in Zambia. That is a clear indication of how political will has increased in Zambia. And because of that, we have seen also he has gone further to even reduce duty on solar-powered irrigation equipment. So all smallholder farmers that want to mechanize their food production, they can be able to buy, irrigation equipment that are solar-powered without paying any duty. And also we saw them removing duty on geothermal equipment. So all these are initiatives that is put in place to ensure that participation in this space is smoothened, and that transfer of technology can be made easy between Zambia and wherever the source could be. And that is good, but not enough, because we don't even have a climate change policy, law. But the good news is consultations are ongoing right now, and the final bill has been sent to the Minister of Justice. And the expectation is very soon we are going to have, for the first time in the history of Zambia, climate change bill. And we have seen a lot of increased participation also from private sector. I made mention of Zambia National Commercial Bank and Zambia Industrial Commercial Bank, who are actually like stakeholders that are involved in preparing themselves to run climate finance. And those are good gestures that have been, scored here in Zambia. You have seen our participation in the COP has been very active. We are chairing the Africa Group of Negotiators, and all these are good examples to show how much progress we are making as far as advancing the climate movement is concerned, both from government side, private sector side, from civil society side, where I'm coming from as well, and also in particular youth participation perspective. So I can say that is the score. And in terms of at African level, I think you may be aware about the achievements made at the African COP in Egypt, Sharm el-Sheikh, where for the first time the loss and damage fund was established. And now, even before that, I have been previously part and parcel of an African-wide campaign to call on the African Development Bank to stop investing in coal-powered projects. And we saw the response was very positive. The African Development Bank made a statement that they will no longer be financing coal. And all these are some of the small examples, but very significant strides being made in as far as positioning Africa and also Zambia in particular in the readiness to inspire climate resilience at country level, but also at African perspective level. We saw for the first time, Nico, with the hosting of the African Climate Summit, where all our presidents attended, and they were talking the African agenda on climate change. What are we doing? What is our action? What kind of support do we need? Technology, technical capacity building. And those are the issues that really are positioning Africa in terms of being steady and also focused in terms of movement on climate action.
For all the difficulties you're facing, this is actually quite a sort of a roll call for, great success and great achievements. And of course, that must be very motivating as well, to sort of see that actually all that hard work, that there is some kind of return on that personal investment as well. So that's really, I'm really glad to hear that. Now, when we talk about climate change, it can feel a bit abstract. It's because it's so, you can't really grasp it so well. But its impacts are, well, part of the problem is they are delayed. So it's not, you can't really say, okay, here's some pollution and here's the impact. There's a kind of a time lag. So it's very hard sometimes to tie the impact to the actual pollution, the output of CO2 and all the rest. So, but of course, the impact in the long run is very tangible. And we see it in an increase in the kind of average temperature over time. And we see it in other contexts. We see it in kind of extreme weather events and all the rest. Now, in what way, and this is, I think, really what is quite interesting to really important to reflect on, to make it less abstract. In what way does climate change, in very practical, real terms, affect Zambians on the ground? I mean, what are the kind of climate impacts that you're seeing across the country?
Yeah, I think I'm a traditionalist as well, so I love talking about my tradition. So I'll give you a very practical example about what just recently happened. We have experienced the El Nino-induced drought here in Zambia, and I'm part of the ethnic group called the Lozi people, who are found in the western part of Zambia. And every year, when we experience flooding in the floodplains, we celebrate our ceremony called Kuomboka ceremony. And this is where we move our king through the boat we call Nalikwanda, which can have about 200 paddlers and many other boats escorting to move him from the low floodplains to the highland palace through that ceremony. So it was difficult to host our ceremony this year because of the drought. So the water levels are so low, even along the canal that we usually use to move. So we had to change the route. This year, we still held the Komboga, but using a very different route. And the last time that route was used was in 1979 when we experienced the like drought in the Barosi floodplain. So the theme for the Komboka ceremony this year was tagged around a Komboka ceremony in the face of climate change itself. So already those are some of the ways in which we are affected also as a cultural tradition. Culture is very much dear to the hearts of Zambians here. And when we begin to experience impacts that actually anchor on how we celebrate our ceremonies, people easily connect and they can actually see how and to what extent we have been impacted. Also, as part of our dress code in the Narikwanda, we usually use animal skins, but that's no longer the case now because there are very few to no animals around that we can just kill and get the skin just for the sake of you looking good in the boat. So now we use artificially made, animal skins as a way to adapt to that. So already people are seeing this is not the original skin for the animal that we used to use then, but why are we using a different one now? So that is how our culture itself has been affected in terms of our ceremony that we celebrate. But also beyond that, Zambia is an agriculture focused or rather centered economy as well, apart from the copper production that is where it is well known for. So we heavily depend on rain-fed agriculture. Over 1.5 million smallholder farmers heavily depend on rain-fed agriculture. And when we experienced drought this time around, it was very clear that we are going to experience food insecurity. And of course, that is not our desired future. So that is one way in which we have been impacted in terms of climate change itself. And we have seen efforts being made by government. One of it is the introduction of winter maize production, the idea to encourage farmers to begin to participate in winter maize production so that we can be able to produce actually throughout the year. Also, the other calling has been food diversification because our staple food is maize, which is where we get our shima from. So the question is, is maize the only food? What is the alternative to maize itself? So that probably we can go millet, we can go sorghum, and all these initiatives, discussions are engaging stakeholders who are actually experiencing the challenge itself. The clear one where everyone gets the buy-in is the food, the cost of food has gone up. The bag of milimi, which used to cost 50 kwacha years and years back, now we are buying it at 300 kwacha, the same amount of milimi, 25 kg. So people asking questions and the answers are clearly indicating to them to say, this is because food production has been made difficult due to the changes in the climate itself, which have made production of food a bit more costly, but very difficult itself. Some once arable land is no longer arable. So some once, we have some land that we are near some streams of water, and there's no more streams of water around. So even irrigation becomes difficult. So now the realities has caught up with all of us, and this is now where everyone is becoming a stakeholder to find what will be the solution that we can put in place. And when that happens, it means children can't go to school. It means mothers cannot feed their children, and it's a cross-party issue altogether. And now all sectors of development are affected in the like manner. So drought is number one, flooding a number of Zambians, hundreds and hundreds of them lost their properties and goods. Just in this particular rain season, we even had cholera outbreak because of the rain. So some of the areas here, especially here in Osaka, called Mrs. Compound, Kanyama, there's a serious outbreak in terms of cholera itself. And this was just because of the flash floods that we experienced. And it was water all over the place. People even lost their properties. Some cars got damaged. They cannot move, and so on. So it's very serious. Some hotels actually had water locked in their reception area, and which means loss of business as well. So really, the impacts are beginning to be more visible for Zambia in particular, and this is why probably there's also increased political will because everyone is seeing what is happening. The DMM, which is the Disaster Management and Mitigating Unit for Zambia, is always busy flying around trying to transport aid in terms of food and other materials to affected families. In the eastern part, people lost their houses, their properties, and that was not a desired, sight for anyone who really means well for the well-being of our country, Zambia. So this is what I can share in terms of how we are experiencing the adverse impacts of climate change. It's very real, it's very visible, and there's even more examples to give in this like manner.
Now, one of the organizations you founded is Young Volunteers for Environment Zambia. I understand that it is, if you like, a franchise. Isn't that correct? So there's other young volunteers for environment in other countries. So tell me a little bit about that organization. First of all, about its structure, how it works across borders and all the rest. But also then, of course, what you did with that in Zambia.
Yeah, so the Young Volunteers for the Environment in Zambia is a local youth movement, but of course affiliated to the Young Volunteers for the Environment Africa, which is called International. So our headquarters is in Togo, where we have our Executive Director International, Mr. Sena Aluka. So we are in over 35 African countries where we do various programs, initiatives, mainly focused on mobilizing youth voices, but also strengthening our contribution to building climate resilient Africa. So for Zambia in particular, our priority area has been capacity building in terms of climate education, community projects such as tree planting, and also most importantly, stakeholder engagement and collaboration on the climate space subject itself. So one key example, some of the stuff we have been able to do is the one I've shared earlier on what we did to call on the president to declare climate emergency. We partnered with the Climate Clock Worldwide, where for the first time we introduced the climate clock in Zambia, which is a clock that indicates how much time we have left to act responsibly to avoid even much worse impacts from climate change itself, which is by 2030. And this is based on scientific reports by IPCC, which indicated that we only have about 480 gigatons of carbon left that we can exploit, of course, emit. And beyond that, we are in the crisis itself. So we are at the forefront of ensuring awareness around that. And we do so also when we talk about capacity building. Last year, we trained 35 young journalists on climate reporting because we believe storytelling is the one powerful tool that needs to be actually tapped into and leveraged. We just through storytelling, we'll be able to attract the right partners, we'll be able to tell the right picture, to give the right picture on how our communities are actually being impacted by the climate change subject itself. Storytelling will be able to help us connect with the people heart to heart beyond the scientific knowledge on climate change itself. So we thought probably by investing in training journalists, we are young, we'll be able to have more people report on climate change itself. And the more we talk about it, the better for us. This year, we partnered with the United States of America Embassy here in Zambia through the Public Affairs section, where we also trained 65 young people on climate change science, on climate change information, mainly to help them be able to be tools and advocates that can further push the agenda forward to reaching out, even the masses that are not reached out through our means and ways. And also through the Young Volunteers for the Environment in Zambia, we have been very dedicated to providing alternatives in terms of what are the solutions we're offering on the table. So I founded, or rather I invented, in the process of developing the final prototype for what I'm calling Nature App, which is an application designed to provide climate-compatible information to smallholder farmers across the country, Zambia, over 1.5 million that I mentioned earlier on. Why? Because everyone gets stuck. Even now, when we have this crisis and drought that has been declared a national emergency and disaster, people don't know what to do. So we are looking at the farmer and their ability to access climate compatible information to make better farming decisions. And through that app, I desire to have an environment where it is seamless for a farmer anywhere where they are across the parts of the country Zambia to access this information. And of course, thanks to the support I received through the Improve South Global Cooperation on Climate Action under their Climate Solutions Lab, and we are one of the top 10 finalists and the Zambia National Commercial Bank, what they call Green Innovation Challenge. So this is a game changer, and I'm hoping and looking for an opportunity to even have more financing that we can fully develop this prototype into something that can help our farmers across. Not only in Zambia, it will be able to it will be easy and possible to scale this idea up to many other parts of Sub-Saharan Africa in as far as trying to address the challenge that we are facing, because food production is very critical. And imagine, Nico, at a click of the button, you can speak to any expert on agriculture, whichever field that may relate to. At the click of the button, you can be able to receive advice on what you expect in terms of weather. At the click of the button, you can detect pests and diseases that affects your crop and what you can do about it. At the click of the button, you can access your farmer wallet and be able to save up, because some saving up also is critical for our farmers. And usually they get stranded during planting season, they don't have resources, they have to pay for their school fees. So they will be able to save up, and the only way they can withdraw the money from the app is through the inputs that they may need, or the mechanization, the equipment they need to increase their food production. And that's the vision that I have in terms of that application. So those are some of the examples that we are trying to work on as Young Volunteers for the Environment right now. And today, as I'm speaking to you, we are organizing for the first time National Youth Climate and Art Symposium that will be held in August this year in partnership with the Ministry of Youth, Sports and Art. And people were asking why Ministry of Youth, Sports and Art. We say no, we want to communicate to the world that the climate change and environment subject is not only about the Ministry of Green Economy and Environment, but all other stakeholders are critical stakeholders. And that's how we went for this program with the Minister of Youth. Of course, we still engage the Minister of Environment as well at the later stage. So the idea is to bring all voices in the space together for a 3-day event. And the most important thing is we have tried all the other methods and channels of communicating the climate subject, but it seems it's not working, or it's working, but it's taking time. But through art, we believe that it will be easier to communicate, it will be faster to communicate, and to be easier to mobilize even more participation from citizens across. So that's what we are doing here. We are still voluntary-based organizations. I'm not paid for what I do. No one pays me for what I do. But I know very soon we'll establish Young Volunteers for the Environment as an institution that can even employ young people full-time and begin to even do more work than what we're doing now.
Now, it's what I find quite, or what I'd like to know, I mean, what I find interesting and also difficult to get my head around is like in a country like Zambia that has a less developed communications infrastructure than, say, European countries or developed countries generally. How do you get the message out? I mean, how do you reach beyond the kind of the usual suspects in your kind of circle of colleagues, friends, in your network? How do you actually reach deep into villages, into regions of Zambia that are remote or hard to get to? What kind of strategies do you have? And is that possible at all?
Yeah, currently, I can say it's possible because most of our parts of our country, we have local radio stations, national radio stations that reach out to most of all these parts. But of course, to some extent, others don't even have access in terms of gadgets to use to listen to a radio program. We have done radio programs before in local languages. We have been on TV. We have been in print media. But of course, to your point, this can only reach the most obvious audience. But what really inspired me is the level of participation, even on radio, for the fewer masses that we're able to reach out to, especially those that are not in the prime areas, like urban areas. They're really engaged, they're asking really tough questions, and also they have expressed levels of interest in wanting to participate. But really the mechanism on how they can participate is what becomes even more difficult. So therefore, we are left mostly with no option but the most expensive route, which is to actually go physically in those communities and do sensitization, do awareness creation programs, engage them in tree planting engage them in community building in terms of the community gardens and teaching them some of these things whilst for them, which is very expensive but also most effective at the moment.
Absolutely. I mean, it's interesting. I was thinking back to a time when there was no internet. I mean, I grew up, without mobile phones. I'm very old. I grew up, before all of that happened. And I was just thinking, what did we do? How did we get the message out before mobile phones and before the internet? And of course, there are issues like literacy. So if you have a large population that can read and write, then you have got different possibilities from, say, when you have a population that doesn't, or if you have a multilingual population, as you just alluded to, with different local languages, which again kind of fragments your population in a way. Now, but one thing that we used to do just for fun was chain letters. So basically, write a letter to 5 friends and ask each one of them to write a letter to 5 friends. And this leads to exponential growth, because if everybody kind of then sends on 5 letters, it kind of goes. But of course, that sort of presupposes that people write and read, and you're talking about a particular type of population and audience. But it's interesting to think about kind of creative strategies, isn't it? That can actually, yes, you're absolutely right. Going there, talking to people is the best thing. But as you also say, it's the most expensive, the most resource intensive, and also in some ways the slowest, because you can only do so much. So there must be other ways, and you're absolutely right to use the arts, musicians, dancers, people who actually have an audience of their own, and reach that audience through live events. I remember when I spent many years in the UK, and when the UK had this referendum to leave the European Union, I was on the side of the campaign to campaign for the UK to stay inside the European Union. So and one strategy that we kind of developed was that, like say, at concerts or at public, readings, concerts, public events of that kind, cultural events, we would kind of get in touch with the promoters and ask them whether like something could be read out, before the event, a message because you have an assembled audience there, and it's a ready-made place to read something out, isn't it? So you only need one person who can read and write, and that person, if there's an audience, can stand there and kind of basically broadcast, physically being there. I mean, I think these kinds of strategies are ways of getting around technology. And also, I think increasingly, even in the kind of industrialized world, as the internet becomes ever more kind of commodified and commercialized and full of hate messages and hate stuff,
Yeah.
these kind of offline analog strategies, I think, gain in relevance again as well. So absolutely, I think it's brilliant that you do stuff with the other thing is in Europe, and I find this quite interesting. When we talk about young people, we generally mean people in the age group 16 to 24. My experience is that when people talk about young people in Africa, and not just Zambia, generally speaking, they tend to talk about people much older. I mean, yes, of course, 16-year-olds as well, but it doesn't stop at 24, isn't that right? So when you say, young people, give me a sense of, what kind of age range you're targeting.
Yeah, so for Africa, and according to Africa Charter, young person, and according to African Union is 15 to 35.
Excellent.
So then,
but do you kind of like reach beyond the 25? Are you kind of being liberal with that kind of 25, or do you is it for you really 25 and that's it?
No, actually, it's 35, so 15 years to 35 years old. Yeah, but of course, to some extent, we do have people who go beyond that for obvious reasons. So, for example, even if you look at the education, policies or other frameworks, you find that in Europe it's easier to find a 21-year-old with a PhD, but in Africa, a 21-year-old will still be struggling with high school. And then maybe they'll be able to have their first degree at 35 and then begin to actively contribute between 35 to 40. So there are so many other factors that usually limit participation, especially of African youth, in some of these opportunities, which if they are European aligned. So they'll limit by the age group, then they'll leave out a number of other young people. So usually it's quite a challenge. And which is why I think clarity on what youth is usually is required before any engagements whatsoever is done.
I mean, the other thing that I find quite interesting when in Europe, when you're talking about, youth groups or youth clubs or anything to do with youth, it tends to be distinctly non-political. It's like table tennis, it's whatever kind of summer holidays, it's summer schools, it's all kinds of things they're not political. They're kind of just entertainment, they're kind of networking, they're character building, all this kind of things. When I talk to people in your line of work in Africa, when they say youth, I often get the impression that it's more political, or should I say more about progressive politics. There's a sort of a sense that there's a generation of young Africans coming up which wants to do things differently, isn't so much tied down by tradition, possibly more liberal. I don't know, but I get this sense that when people say, "Oh, I'm doing youth work in Africa," it's much more to do with campaigning, with kind of environmental stuff. It might be all kinds of peace work. It might be, in Europe, you wouldn't think about these kinds of activities when you think about youth work. Can you talk a little bit about, I find that interesting because that seems to be a thing, and I've encountered this in different African countries. How is that? Why is youth such a big thing? Maybe in Zambia as well.
Yeah, for sure, you are right. Africa is fairly a young continent. About 60% of African population is youth. So they have the voice, they have the influence, and everyone is looking up the youth, especially the politician in this particular sense. So whichever the direction youth take, it is of interest to the politician. That's why it's very difficult to actually sometimes decipher politics from the involvement of young people themselves. Here in Zambia, we have changed governments twice, where we changed the political party that was in power, and that mainly was propagated as a result of the influence of young people themselves. Even the most recent one, 2021, we saw active involvement and participation of young people that determined the outcome. So usually the idea here is because they know they have the numbers, the youth have the energy, the time, and of course, if you can win the hearts of the young people, then you can win the whatever you want to achieve. So, but also that becomes like a limiting factor because whatever you do now as a young person, for example, some of us who are non-partisan, we are doing this for the greater cause of the country at large, socio-economic benefits, environmental benefits. It's either a politician somewhere may see that as an opportunity to take advantage of that for their own political gain, or probably they won't even support you at all because what you do has no political influence at the end of the day. So sometimes you experience situations where you may receive or not receive support depending on to what extent what you are doing will contribute to the political gain for a particular politician. So that's, to some extent, it's a benefit. To the other perspective, is actually a challenge to our activism as young people in Africa, which is what we're trying to change as we continue to work.
Yeah, I mean, there's one other aspect of youth, of course, which really has in Europe and I sort of say like in North America as well, but definitely in Europe, sort of really kind of sort of energized a sort of a new culture of young politics, and it's very much about the environment. Fridays for Future. I mean, Greta Thunberg, the Swedish woman who did the school strike and all that. She was like, what, 13, 14 when she sort of sat outside the parliament in Stockholm demonstrating for the environment. And she unleashed a massive global movement, a youth movement. And of course, it is very clear why, well, it's not so clear why, but it makes sense that it succeeded to the extent it did, because it is young people who will have to face the consequences of climate change, isn't it? So, I mean, if you're in your 70s, then, you'll be okay. And if you're not, then you have a problem anyway. But if you're young, your entire life ahead of you, that really, really matters. So that's another aspect here. Now, moving on to sort of my last point here on my list, there are obviously a range of issues that affect sort of Zambia. Some of it have to do with mitigation, sort of somehow dealing with the loss and the damage caused by climate change. And this, of course, is kind of like a political issue because, of course, it's from a European or North American or kind of a a rich world's perspective, it's a cost. There's not much else. It's a cost. And this is why countries drag their heels. There is this other aspect which has to do with investment in sort of climate compatible or industries in green and clean tech and all the rest. Now, there we're not just looking at the cost, we're also looking at potential returns. And we're looking at you sort of say copper as an industry in Zambia. That's what electricity runs in, isn't it? Copper wire, so it's obviously a massive industry, and it's a great wealth that Zambia has and needs to guard well. So there are the kind of investment opportunities on the one hand, and then the costs on the other. And then there is a kind of a sort of development agenda as well, isn't there? It goes back, really, decades, sort of economic and sort of international development and development and aid, and all of these things need integrating. Now, where do you see in this, taking into account that this isn't something just today, it's something that's been, there's histories, there's kind of traditions, there's ways of doing things, there's networks, there's and so on and so forth. So taking all of these different, the investment side, the kind of the pure cost side, the kind of, if you like, the policy side of international development, taking all and the different organizations, big NGOs with their own agenda. So if you take all of these different components, where do you see the role of local NGOs and activists like yourself in relation to the international community, and where do you see the role and the place for the international community? If you were to kind of place them in, to kind of relate them, if you give us a sense of where they should be and where you should be.
Yeah, I think the most important thing is we should be on the ground as local and be able to tell our stories accurately and more responsibly. And I think one of the missing link here is usually data. We need to make data-driven decisions. We need to lobby for data-driven policies so that it will be easier even to go out there and begin to engage the international community based on data and not opinions and not feelings and not anything else. Because that is what we are missing in terms of the local organizations in the larger perspective itself. Yes, we have experienced the adverse impacts of climate change. How? To what extent? What are the numbers involved? Okay, yes, we want to transition to renewable energy, but what are the numbers in terms of economic productivity when we switch to renewable energy? What are the benefits? Do we still meet the same, intended benefit in as far as the development sectors is concerned, such as education, agriculture, so on and so forth? So we need to start talking numbers. And I think where the international community comes in is to provide that technical capabilities for us to enable the local to be able to achieve this in the larger perspective, in the more bankable perspective. What I mean by bankable is, which, for example, if it's a carbon trading system or market that has been developed out there in Europe, and we have an opportunity in Africa, what are the numbers in terms of to what extent will the local benefit from that arrangement? Of course, it's carbon offset, which is very political. Africa still feels Europe is trying to take advantage of Africa further. But to answer that question, the international community should be able to clarify clearly what are the limits, what are the benefits for Africa and for Europe itself. Yes, we have unique challenges that we face, but we all want to win at the end of the day, but not to worsen the situation of the other even more. So I think there's need to have a very honest dialogue and conversation between international community and Africa, and in particular, in as far as climate finance is concerned. But for that to happen, we need the data. For that to happen, we need the commitment from the international community. We need timely commitment and responsibility from the international community, because that's what is missing. We have very good report from the COP28 in Dubai, UAE, and numbers are really impressive to look at. And for loss and damage alone, we saw about $700 million that was placed. But where is that money? When is it going to hit the account? Whose account is going to reach to? And by that time, if at all it reaches, we might already lost even more people, more properties. And this is the challenge that we have at the moment, where the international community, yes, they claim to have shown commitment, which we see in pledges, but we want to see them actually working their commitment by delivering on the promises they're making from their end as well. But also for Africa and also local organizations, we shouldn't just wait and keep waiting until the climate finance reaches us. The question is, to what extent are we preparing the ground ready to actually receive this funding so that we can actually actualize and implement some of the projects that are necessary to ensure that we remain a planet that will save the life for all, including animals themselves, and the entire biodiversity in the larger perspective. But also, do we have the skills? Also, do we have the systems in place? What are the policies that needs to be put in place? The environmental, social governance systems should be put in place so that we are ready also, because you need to be ready. The climate finance is not just about availability of money, like I said earlier on, Nico, but also availability of systems and policies that can help us make governance around climate subject meaningful, and also that we can be able to witness meaningful benefits across all board. We have had projects that have come from the international community to Africa, which end up producing very nice, beautifully designed reports, but still leave people hungry, still leave people being more impacted, still leave polluted environments that will cause being more harm. That's not what we desire. So we want to see an arrangement which is, of course, equitable in as far as responsibility is concerned, so that the partnership between the international community and the local climate movements in Africa should actually be seen to benefit in real terms the people and the environment itself.
Excellent. I think this is a really good point to stop. Thank you very, very much. This has been really, really interesting. Akufuna, I think maybe if we have another chat in a year's time, because the idea is to sort of see a sort of a story develop over time. And I think we've got quite a good sort of snapshot of, of where you are at the moment, what you've already achieved, but we also get a sense of the long road ahead. And so it would be very interesting to revisit this in about a year's time if you're interested, and to continue the conversation then.
Absolutely, that would be, I think, all pleasure will be mine, and we really need to have more and more of such conversations. We need to talk to each other. That's when we can better understand each other's needs and then be better positioned to solve our own problem and challenges as a collective unit.
Absolutely. Akufuna, thank you very much for this amazing dialogue. It's been really, really nice talking to you. And we will, of course, continue this sort of like behind the scene as well. I'm glad we met, and I look forward to developing that relationship.
Thank you so much, Nico, and keep doing what you are doing.
I will indeed. Have a good one, yeah? All the best. Bye-bye.